Our last speaker this morning, followed by questions, is a dear friend, Jimmy McGinty, Colonel Jimmy McGinty, a Brooklyn boy, graduate of St. John's University, and with me maneuvered through basic school and graduated in the spring of '67. Jim's a commo, worked in I-Corps, worked at Caisson, and worked for a while in the G1 personnel side, stayed in the Marine Corps Reserve, and I know he would want me to underscore this. He's proud to be a member of the board of directors of the Marine Corps Scholarship Foundation. And as you've already heard, as well as all of the other meritorious events in his life, he's also an author, and his book is Right to Kill, a Brooklyn Tale. Jimmy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, sir. You know, the old adage, I stand between you and lunch. So I'm going to, and I come from Brooklyn, and we talk rather rapidly, so I'll try to invoke that trait. My job was an interesting one here. Again, we wanted to talk about hometown issues and coming home and communications with home. But I thought anybody's experience, now we've heard some terrific experiences, so I'm glad that I'm not going to just give you mine. Instead, my job was to speak to the voice of basic school class 367 and OCS class 41. And to do that, I decided to undertake a survey. I was helped in this survey a great deal by a man called David Ogilvy, who's also Brooklyn born, and he's been in the market research survey business for almost 50 years. And so he helped me create this survey, and we went out and surveyed last January all 480 members of our class. And I hope that impresses you that after 50 years, we actually have a database of all 450 members of the class of 3-67, as well as OCS 41. So that's kind of amazing. We started out, by the way, OCS class 41 and basic school with about 580. As Ron just said, we lost 48 KIAs. Another 60 have passed on, but everybody else is still around. We'll talk about that later. We got what I would consider a magnificent response, 221 responses, or a 42% response rate. So for all the statisticians out there, that's a highly, highly projectable sample against that N of 480. So we have a lot of projectability. However, and we're going to that'll provide context to some of the remarks and supports most of the remarks, by the way. It'll be interesting when we take a look at that. I've spent on the civilian side of the house 45 years in the information business. So I know a little bit about surveys, and I can tell you this. Every survey has biases. There are built-in biases to every survey. There's construction biases. We'll talk about that a little bit. So I would just caution everyone, you can project against that universe, which again, structurally is biased because it includes only officers, for example. But you really can't project this against all Vietnam veterans. So this is all about basic school class 367. We'll tell you what they look like, and then we ask them very specific questions, and we'll give you those answers. So with that, just to take a peek, let's see if this thing works. Okay. We're going to go in almost the timeline. We're going to talk a little bit. I'm going to move it very quickly through some of these slides. The slides, incidentally, are all over there. So I might move through some quickly because we had a lot of data. As you can imagine, this was a 32-question questionnaire, and we've tabulated and cross-tabulated a lot. So we're going to talk about Tet because that obviously was something. We're just going to ask a few very pointed questions, and we're going to get some very reliable answers. Coming home on leave and the anti-war movement and areas like that, that's what I really want to dwell on because that's all a part of the hometown experience, isn't it? And then what happened after Vietnam? What happened when who left the Marine Corps, who stayed in? So we're going to cover those things. So moving right along, where did they come from, this basic school class? And not surprisingly, they came all over, I think, 44 states. It's clustered the way the United States used to look 50 years ago. All right? So what we have, about a third of the class was from big cities, metro areas. About a third of the class was suburban areas. And then a third of the class really came from the great heartland, the rural communities all around. So nothing really spectacular, except it was very representative geographically of our country. One of the biggest demographic items, and let's see if this one works, yeah, is this point right here. No military service in the family. 9 out of 10 of our classmates, or the respondents, had some father, brother, who had fought in World War II or Korea. Amazing. 90% had people who were in the military. 10%, 1 out of 10 didn't. So that's a really distinguishing characteristic of the group. Think about that today, it's probably just the reverse, if you think about it. So 10% had nobody in the military, 90% did. It was a highly educated group, obviously, and I say educated because 85% came from colleges, and many had advanced degrees, by the way, in addition to just undergraduate degrees. But 15%, and this is the real educated part, were Mustangs. And I hope you all know what that is. Again, these are prior enlisted people who were part of our class, and they brought with them quite an education. So when I look at who was educated and who had PhDs and what have you, I always remember that 15% of our classmates really had the experience, and it brushed off on a lot of us in OCS and basic school, and further on in active duty. So suddenly you could see this is atypical. This is not a normal Vietnam vet. The majority, this is amazing, 53% of us were married in basic school or before. I would have said 20% or something like that. So 1 out of every 2 persons were married, and I think we were treated today to a view that we rarely get, and I wanted to thank Miriam. And also, my wife of 50 years, who was also a basic school bride, is in the audience. Can everybody that's a spouse during the basic school period stand up, please? I know there's a couple here. Is it just Pat? Okay. All right. Well, oh, I'm sorry, there's Janice, too. Pat and Janice, yeah. And of course, so we have 3 basic school brides, we call them, and there's a lot more around. So we'll talk about marriage and what it meant later on, but again, that's clearly atypical of a Vietnam vet. I don't think, maybe less than 20%, farther south of 20% were married in Vietnam. Our class is 53%. And another 10% were engaged, by the way, so let's move on. When we received our MOSs in basic school, you know, that's about the 4th month where you're actually assigned an MOS. Not surprisingly, 33% of our group was assigned either an 03, an 08, or an armored or recon MOS. 33%. The next big group, 20% from the air wing, 14% were helicopter pilots, and 6% were fixed wing types. So that's over 50% of the people, real first-line officers. You have lots of people, combat service support people, that also served in infantry battalions. There were, at that time, 18 infantry maneuver battalions in Vietnam, 21 once the 26 Marines came in, 21 maneuver battalions. So if you were a commo, you could be with one of them, or if you were a supply officer, you know, you would be one of them. You might be an engineering officer, you might be a motor T officer, an intel person, and again, you'd be working with a line infantry battalion. And you would have platoons, of course. So later on, we'll talk about casualty rates and what these figures actually mean. The communications home, again, it's been covered very nicely, I think, and it's a very busy slide. All I would say about it is it was a very prolific group. Not surprisingly, the wives, almost weekly, 70% of their percentiles, I think. Yeah, it's probably percentages. 77% of the people received a letter once a week. That's amazing. Except with Miriam, you got almost 2 or 3 a week you produced. So we won't really dwell too much on this. Parents, of course, received the letters, and you've seen what that meant to lots of people. The letters and tapes coming home, this is kind of interesting, and I think we picked up on it today. By the way we read this is, again, every time, most times, occasionally by colors. What you see there is there was an awful lot of pride expressed in letters coming home. And again, we heard that today. They sounded generally upbeat. There really wasn't any bitching when you think about it. The last question there, express frustration about your experiences. That almost never happened. It happened maybe on a very, very under 5% of the time, the cases. So it was largely upbeat communications, and much of it was really not telling the truth. You know, much of it, and we all know that. So, you know, we BS'd a lot of things, and we left a lot of things out of those letters. The news itself, however, was kind of interesting. Another slide we couldn't put up here today. Most people were unaware of what was going on, and not surprising. If you're down with a company or you're at a battalion, you don't get a lot of news, and you don't care about much news. But if you, and we did ask the question, and we did get answers. And national political news probably rated number one, followed closely by sports. Entertainment news was a big deal. Anti-war news, again, that had some interest, and not the greatest interest, but it had some interest, and we'll talk about that in a second. While we're on the topic of news, and I've cut a lot of this out, we just don't have the time to cover it, and again, I think many speakers talked about the types of coverage we did have. What now I want to do is go into Tet, and I'll segue into Tet by supporting a claim made earlier, and that is, we asked the question, the media coverage during the Tet Offensive had a positive effect on morale. That was the question. 70% of the people who responded, the respondents, disagreed with that. The media reported accurately on the situation during the Tet Offensive. 74%. 3 out of 4 people just don't believe that. Again, we heard one perspective from Ron, and I don't know really why this was so vociferous. And again, this is just what the respondents are saying. They simply did not believe the coverage was helpful, and they simply did not believe that the coverage, at least now looking back 50 years. So once again, that's a bias with this thing. You got a bunch of 70-year-olds recalling something that happened 50 years ago. But they're pretty consistent. We went and asked specific questions, not detailed questions, but questions like, Tet received a lot of attention, but my unit fought more intense engagements at other times during my tour of duty. So as pervasive as Tet was, in 70% of the cases, 7 out of 10 people said, hey, I had bigger fights elsewhere. I think everybody that talked today cites something that really wasn't Tet-related. Okay. The attacks, but here are certain things, again, which was supported by comments. The attacks by the VC and NVA in 1968 were much more widespread than I realized at the time. Again, 7 out of 10 of us would agree with that statement. I wasn't concerned about geopolitics at all, just doing my job as a Marine and getting home in one piece. 80% of the guys felt that that statement is correct. At home, this is interesting. I didn't discuss the Tet Offensive in letters and tapes going home. 85% said that. 85% didn't discuss it. Conversely, coming to them, letters and tapes from home expressed concern about Tet. And that's not surprising given all the news. But how cagey we were, right, not to say anything about it going home. Now, Tet and history, this is, I think, amazingly consistent with the theme of the conference and what history really revealed. Once again, in an amazing consistency, 85% of the respondents agree that Tet was a military defeat for the VC and the NVA. 85%, 84%, probably the same percentage, that it was, in fact, a propaganda victory for Hanoi. And, of course, it was a turning point in the war. So from the standpoint of all the respondents, from the standpoint of OCS 41, TBS 367, you know, we're, I think, very consistent in our attitudes and opinions about this aspect of Tet. Now, to some really interesting stuff, the anti-war issue. We asked a couple of questions about that. What was your reaction to hearing about, media reaction to hearing about anti-war sentiment while you were in Vietnam? While you were in Vietnam. Okay. And you know what? As reflected, this is pre-Tet, most of it, right? So there is some concern and disagreement about it, but not a big deal. 30% of the people were indifferent about what was going on in the anti-war movement. Now, again, as one of the speakers said, 2 years later, it was a bigger deal. Okay? But some people didn't even hear about it, if you can believe. 1 out of 10 people never even heard about protests, which I find amazing. The impact of Marines under my command, same question, but asked a little differently. And there was little impact on morale, at least in, 60% of the respondents said it wasn't a big deal, wasn't a big deal. This is, again, now is 1967, 68. 20% that said there was some concern and disagreement with the protesters. A couple of people actually supported the protesters, by the way, so there you go. But by and large, it wasn't that big a deal until we came home. All right? Now, maybe the most controversial slide in the deck. We just want to watch my time. The experience of anti-war sentiment and actions in coming home. The proverbial spit-upon story. Okay, so what do we have here? We have 34% of the respondents, that's 3 out of 10, experienced some form of hostility. You heard General Labouty talk about a cab in New York City. All I could say is you should have got the cab in Brooklyn because you wouldn't have had any problem. But in all seriousness, so obviously, and I found some of these numbers, I wasn't sure how to take it. 34% of my classmates got involved with some verbal hostility. Now, verbal hostility is not a big deal. We have the First Amendment, so I can understand that. Now, the famous spit upon. I wish all of the lieutenants stayed around, because every young person I meet with tells me, oh, you're a Vietnam veteran. Oh, thanks for your service. Oh, by the way, you were spit upon when you came home, and you were treated like a bum. Well, in fact, that's not true. Now, were people spit upon? Yes. Obviously, 10% of my class was, 9%. Were they physically accosted or shoved? Absolutely. And by the way, in the survey, we have, the last part of the survey is allowing people to make comments. I have 10 pages of comments. And a couple of those comments actually describe being physically accosted. None describe being spit upon. I never could figure out this, who's going to spit upon a Marine? But anyway, but it happened, and I asked the question differently. We said, did you personally experience it? That's one thing. Okay, did you witness that happening? That's quite another thing. And actually, slightly more people witnessed other Marines being verbally harassed or being spit upon or being physically accosted or shoved. Pretty specific, 3 distinctly different instances. Now, the good news and the bad news. That means, by the way, 2/3 of the class were never physically harassed, were never spit upon, or 90% of the class was never spit upon, and 85% of the class was never physically accosted by anybody, which is kind of amazing. So where is the truth in this thing? We don't know. We tabulated and cross-tabulated. I wanted to figure out, were the guys who went back, there were 70 of them went back to the academic community, either as students or professors like Dave. Did they experience anything? A couple did, but not in any greater percentage than guys like me who went to the corporate world. So there's no question that there is some pretty ugly things that people encountered. Again, I don't really worry too much about the verbal hostility, but at the same time, in perspective, everyone thinks that everyone was spit upon, and that simply was not so. The American community did not do that. And even the anti-war movement itself, you could argue had some legitimacy, quite frankly, and I think only a small percentage. So my theory is that just like terrorism, this kind of vile behavior is asymmetric. So a very small group of people who feel they want to go to the gates at Camp Lejeune, or they want to go to LAX airport, or they wanted to go to San Francisco, could make a pretty big deal and could easily verbally harass everybody, and did verbally harass people, obviously. And maybe try to spit upon them, and maybe call them baby killers. So no question about it happening, but it's the scope of it that really comes into question when you really get down to fact-based analysis on this thing. The asymmetric part of it is interesting. The good news, bad news. The other theory I have about this, and this is strictly a personal one, is that because of this, something very good happened. Something very good happened. You know what happened? Nowadays, we still have wars, we still make mistakes, we still screw up, but nowadays, when young people come home, like the young people we saw up here, they're greeted quite favorably, and their services, even old guys like me, when I go to TSA and show them my card, and they say, oh, well, they come to attention, thank you, Colonel, for your service. I got more of that in the last 5 years than I got my entire life, and I assure everybody else that, so what has happened? What good came of this ugliness? The good is, I think, the country, without any executive orders, by the way, without any laws, themselves, we all realized what a travesty this has been. Now, again, proportionally, it wasn't as great as it claimed to be, but it was still a tragedy, and that tragedy has really translated into us really respecting people, particularly people in uniform, whenever and wherever we see them. So I guess that's the good news. Maybe it didn't happen for all of us, but it was maybe worth the price. So this is just a tabulation. I'm going to skip through it. People in academic, non-academic life, we can examine that a little later. I just want to move on. Attitudes on coming home from Vietnam. All right, and this question is an interesting one. It doesn't add up to 100% because we screwed the computer allowed people to vote more than once. But what is interesting, there's 3 cohorts: family and friends, local community, and colleagues and classmates. In 83% of the respondents said that their family and friends were openly welcoming, and you couldn't get better than that. The local community, however, not so necessarily. Didn't say there was anything vile about it, but then classmates and colleagues were also more openly welcoming. Then most people were generally supportive, more positive than negative. That's true of the local community. The part you really want to look at is the questions of were they distant or reserved, more negative than positive, were they implicitly hostile? And again, you see, not so. Not so. There was some hostility, quite obviously, in certain, for certain sectors and certain segments, the local community, for example. But the closer you were, i.e. family and friends, colleagues and classmates, the less likely there was any animosity towards your service. Didn't say there wasn't animosity, but it's less likely in those cohorts. Okay? So that's coming home. Let's take a look at and this is also a bias in the survey, a real bias in the survey, and it's an amazing one. 30% of the people, when they got after their initial 3 or 4 year tour of duty, 30% of the respondents stayed in the Marine Corps. 30%, 60 people, by the way, of the 220. And if you project that to the broader audiences, maybe it's 80 or 100 stayed in the, and of those, 37% did a second tour in Vietnam. 65% of that 30%, if you will, and I mean, I have the numbers, so I don't want to bore you with things. Yeah, but that would be about 40 people retired from active duty military service, including Lieutenant General Labuti. We also have Lieutenant General Ayers, and we also had General, 4-star General Dake. So there was 3 generals, a whole raft of colonels and lieutenant colonels. In addition to that, so that introduces a little bit of a bias to the study because this is military people answering these questions. If we look at the reserves, 32% of the people stayed in the reserve. That's amazing. But as we all know, it's very difficult to actually put 20 years in the reserve and retire, but 25% of those people did. That's about 18 of us actually made it through, so to speak, the retirement process, and we got our bluey or whatever that was, and you get it at age 60. I forgot, it's been so long. But so you have, between the active service and the reserve service, quite a number of people affiliated with the Marine Corps. And again, that's a bias of a survey like this. So, immediately after leaving the Marine Corps, what happened to these guys? Well, not surprisingly, looks like 55% joined or rejoined the private sector. By the way, just to jump down, a number of them set their own businesses up, and that's also in the private sector. Looks like close to 10% did that. The amazing statistic here is how many people went back to graduate school or law school. Mind you, we had 25 lawyers when we started, so now we got a whole bunch of people who went back for their law degrees or their MBAs. And I know several of you in the audience did that, but it's amazing. 35% of the people, once they came back and left active duty, went back to school. And remember those Mustangs I was talking about? A whole bunch of people went back to school, 6% of the total respondents, to complete undergraduate education. So for whatever reason, there was a real zest in this class for higher education, or education in general, higher education in particular. So a highly educated group, let's just see now. I want to make sure I want to get my, yeah, okay. The survey, we made comments as well as answering questions. And again, that's the comments we talked about. We got about 10 pages of comments, and they fall into 5 categories. Pride in the Marine Corps service, all kinds of statements about that. Some not so pleasant statements about anti-war protesters, specific incidents in the Vietnam War, not surprisingly, we heard a few of those today. However, the toughest comments to take are what we just got from Ron, and which is really pervasive in the class, that from a national policy perspective, the war certainly was a disaster, okay? And I think that, the truth be told, most of us feel that way. That's 20/20 hindsight, however. You know, we don't know what we would have done if we didn't go, you know, that's that line of thinking, but certainly a disaster from, and a bad thing. That doesn't, however, I don't think, relate to our activities, but that's a fact. We just cannot get away from that. And those comments are really, again, when you look at some of them, they're really acidy in terms of their specificity. Again, a lot of people want us to tell the folks from Virginia Tech and from VMI to be very cautious about the pursuit of a career in which, you know, sometimes political problems can cause a lot of problems in life, so we just have to be careful about that. That's all I'll say on that one. But yeah, that's like intellectual quicksand, really going after that one. So these are comments on the surveys. Now, it's all well and good, but here are the fortunes of war. This is what happened to that class. In addition to the 48 KIAs, Norman Lane being one of them, and we're obviously, it's all of those people in addition to Norman Lane we talk about today. The second thing going down there, 22% were also casualties. So if you add the 48 to the, which is 9% to the 22, 31% of basic school class 367 were casualties. 31%. Permanently disabled, of that group of casualties, there are 10%, and many of these people fall into 2 categories. 10% were permanently disabled, and of that percent, and could be the same, required long-term medical care. Suffered from PSTD or similar problems, 22%, and that's 22% who admit it. Now remember the people who didn't respond, you know, the non-respondents to the survey? One of the great reasons when we approach people and they don't want to talk to you is the fact that these people are living with or vestiges, or if not, actual PTSD itself. So I think that number might even be conservative. Experienced domestic problems, we heard that this morning, although that 26% is well below the national average, right? Well below the national average. And the other one I skipped over, I didn't want to skip over it, is 74% received some kind of commendation medal. 7 out of 10 of our classmates received something from, it could have been a Navy Com, Bronze Star, slew of Silver Stars. We have a couple of, how many bronze? We have 2 Navy Crosses, and I don't know how many Distinguished Flying Crosses. So 7 out of 10 received it. So, but that being said, that's an awful difficult price to pay. If you think about it, you think about that price, and you think about the issues that, in terms of national policy and how we all think that that policy wasn't so good for America. If you think about that, and then you think about the ugly incidences that occurred, and you say to yourself, I wonder what these guys really think. And the bottom line question is, hey, what did your service as a Marine Corps officer, how did that impact you personally or professionally? And look at this thing. Wow, now this is the real answer. 98% of the respondents believe that they were very positively or positively impacted by their service in the Marine Corps. I wish we had all those Marine option guys up here. I would sell them right now. I mean, and on the professional life, it's the same 98%. And again, I just broke it into two hearts. It's just very positive and positive. A couple of respondents, maybe one or two out of 221, believe it was kind of negative. So that's a ringing endorsement, I think, of, I guess, of the people. And my job was voice, so I'll give you some voice. There is an epilogue to this presentation. This is the last slide, but there's an epilogue. The class still exists, and it's still very active. As Ron alluded to before, we're going to be celebrating our 50th anniversary as commissioned officers, and we're going to have a big shindig in Quantico, Virginia, not far from here. We are going to have between 250 and 300 people at this deal. So we'll be celebrating our commissioning. A lot of people, remember, 53% were married, so a lot of people are going to be celebrating their 50th anniversary at the same time. We're going to be spending lunch with the basic class of Marines, the newest basic class. So these are people who have been commissioned about a year, and they'll have they'll be able to sit with a bunch of whiteheads who spent whose birthday is 50 years of from that time. So that's going to be a lot of fun. Going back to the brand new basic school, by the way, if anybody's not been there. We're going to be presenting $300,000 worth of scholarships. We work with the Marine Corps Scholarship Foundation. I'm very proud to say that. My class did, and we're going to be presenting $300,000 in scholarships to the Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps. And those scholarships are earmarked for the children of enlisted staff NCOs. That's our donor intent, and that's what's going to happen to that money. So that's a big thing. We're going to also, the next day, we're going to have services for, we're going to have 33, we're hosting 33 of our KIA family members, maybe as many as 40. They were very difficult to get after 50 years, but nonetheless, most of them are brothers and cousins, as you might suspect. So we're going to be doing that. We're going to be rededicating a monument that we have in Semper Fi Park to Norman Lane and to the 47 other KIAs we have. So that gives you a little insight into this basic class of 367. And if I had to give it some voice, I'd say there were guys who served their country during pretty tough times. They did it with courage and honor and commitment. They're men who never forgot their fallen brothers, and they're men who never stopped being Marines. So thank you.